This week on Generating Alpha, I'm joined by none other than Michael Chu, the global chairman and co-founder of L Catterton, the largest consumer-focused private equity firm in the world with over $35 billion under management. Over the last 3 decades, Michael has helped transform L Catterton from a boutique investor into a global powerhouse with offices across North America, Europe, Asia, and Latin America. Along the way, he has backed and scaled some of the most iconic consumer brands of our time, including Restoration Hardware, Birkenstock, Equinox, Peloton, and Vitamin Water. Michael has built a reputation as one of the foremost thinkers on what makes consumer businesses succeed, and more importantly, what allows them to endure across generations. In this episode, we'll explore his playbook for building lasting brands, the lessons he's learned from scaling El Catterton into a global leader, and his perspective on the future of consumer investing. If you enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast and give it a 5-star rating on Spotify, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and share it online or to any friends and family who you think might find it interesting. I really appreciate you tuning in. Thank you. Thank you, Michael, for joining me. I really appreciate it. Great to have you on.
Great. My pleasure.
So I'd like to start where I always start. Tell me a little about your childhood, where you grew up. What was that experience like?
Um, I think what's most important is both my parents immigrated from China. So they were first generation. I'm a first generation. And they met here in the US. They didn't know each other in China. But look at, they both, it's kind of an American story. They both had, incredibly privileged lives, respectively, in China, but due to war and circumstances, had to drop everything, leave everything, and came to the US and literally start over. Didn't know the language, didn't know the culture, didn't know anything. Certainly didn't have the privileged life. And and the one thing I recall, which is really an important lesson, is I don't think I've ever heard them complain. And they inculcated themselves to the culture. If you ever met them, you would never know that they were born in a foreign country. That's how acclimated they became in terms of their mannerisms, their ability to speak, write, think. And so it was quite extraordinary. I didn't fully appreciate it, but very middle class. My father was a really accomplished scientist, worked for one company his entire career. My mother was a great educator, super smart. And, against the background, they raised four of us and they had incredible sacrifices, but kind of lived the American dream.
So you go off to start your kind of college education at Bates, and if I'm correct, you majored in psychology and economics and graduated in 1980. What led you to Bates, and what was your kind of time like there? Because I know you're really still involved in Bates, so just tell me about that time.
Yeah, but my mother in particular um, was a great educator, super smart, and growing up, we always valued education. And she believed that the best education at that time was in sort of very small liberal arts type colleges, because you get to have very intimate relationships with the professors, the other classmates. I will say the most important thing out of that experience, I met my wife. Okay, so God forbid if I didn't say that. And we're still married. Okay, after all these years. And so and what Bates and other schools of a similar cohort provided back then, and they still provide today, is sort of requirement to take a wide curriculum. That was a requirement to graduate. So you would take organic chemistry and physics as much as you would take math or science or literature or philosophy. And I think there's a pure good to that myself. And what they really do is they juxtapose that curriculum against a couple sort of foundational principles of the best schools, which is critical thinking, um, how to learn and how to communicate. And those elements, which I think are best seen in these kinds of small schools, are lifelong capabilities. And I use them every day. And Bates was, when I did psychology and economics, they appear like very odd bedfellows. But in fact, the whole behavioral economics that Daniel Kahneman and others sort of pioneered was really the intersection of behavior against economics. And I won't go into all the treaties, but Bates didn't have that obviously at the time. I was interested, and I literally created my own curriculum in my last 2 years. And I was the only student with multiple professors. And I don't think you could have done that in a larger school.
Wow. How did you kind of, from behavioral economics to starting your career in Wall Street, how did that kind of, what was that path?
Yeah, these are these idiosyncratic things. Uh, After 4 years in the rurals of Maine, the last thing I wanted was staying in the rurals of some other area, and I wanted to go to the city. And I was fortunate because one of the alums was the head of a bank, a merchant, very successful merchant bank, and took me on as sort of a young person and threw me into there. And I was living in New York. The following year, I went to London, um, learned some amazing things, and so it was great. So it was really through the alumni connection of the college that got me into this track. And and I didn't know anything, but I learned really fast. And I was heading off to business school when I was 24, and I got this phone call, and without going into all of it, I ended up getting this job in San Francisco as sort of a very senior executive at a bank out there. And I'm not quite sure what the people thought of me when I walked in, but so I was pretty young, and I did that. Then I went to a company in Holland that was owned by the parent company of the company that owned the bank. And then I ultimately made my way to Hong Kong and became the director of finance of that company. Very big, kind of complicated, global sort of position. And it was really in that role up in Hong Kong that I sort of got my first semblance of what was going on in venture capital and private equity, because they had a portfolio of investments that were non-strategic that would fell into this bucket that I oversaw. And I soon fell in love with that sort of bucket as opposed to my day job, and said I want to go expand that. And after a lot of storm and drang, the CEO finally relented. I was persistent like you, and he said, "Okay, I'm gonna go support you. I'll give you some money." And no sooner did that happen, I moved back to the U.S. to go start this. Because you remember back in the 80s, the venture private equity world, it was still pretty nascent and small. Yeah. And so armed with a couple $100 million of capital was like a big deal in those days. And right before I was launching, sort of mid-year, sort of early June 1989, Tiananmen Square broke out in Beijing. Why was that relevant? Because the Hong Kong stock market crashed like over 20% in one day. And this being a Hong Kong public company just basically said, we're going to pull on our horns. We can't give you this capital, come back. And at that time I had gotten married, and my wife said, Hong Kong's a great place to visit, but not to live. And so you were kind of forced into this, pivot point where you either follow your dream, or which is a life lesson, or to take the safe route, because I could have taken the safe route. And I said, the hell with it, I'm going to go follow my dream. And that was the genesis of the firm.
And kind of be more specific, what was your dream at the time? What was the beginning vision of L Catterton? Because you founded it, named Catterton Simon Partners with Frank Vest in 1989. What was the beginning vision? What was the beginning kind of idea? And did you know from the get-go you were going to become global? Because if I understand, like you were at that Hong Kong bank and it was a pretty global position. Did you know at that time? Because I'm pretty sure global private equity firms were pretty rare in those days.
I don't think there was one. I think so. The answer to that was clearly no. But one of the things this company had, it had a global portfolio of businesses, quite large, many of which were consumer businesses. And the company in Holland, where I was the director of finance for a year or so, was a very, very large consumer products marketing, trading, distribution company, quite large. And so you learned, what it meant to be a consumer, and and market their products and services across 50 different countries around the world. And so that was a very, very sort of trial by fire, jump in the middle of the pool, sort of situation. And but you got to see and study instantaneously consumer behavior back in the 80s, before the internet, before anything, and it was an extraordinary thing. And I fell in love with the consumer. And remember, I was sort of a budding behavioral economics person. So I was interested in not just classic economics around rational behavior, efficiency, but what the behavioral economics sort of said is, well, wait a second, it's not so easy as that. There are idiosyncratic, there are cultural, there are cognitive biases, all right, that do influence consumer behavior that need to be taken into account. And and I was fascinated by that. And then if you overlay that against a global perspective, you have even more interesting, complex, analyses to go through. So I kind of fell in love with that. And so I always knew that I wanted to do something in the consumer space. In those days, in the 80s, private equity was pretty generic and mostly leveraged buyouts and of a kind of generalist. I'm not even sure how many industry specialists there were at the time. But, look I think the second takeaway here is follow your dreams and also, do what you really have high passion in. And so I was passionate about the consumer. I studied it in college. I practiced it prior to starting the firm. And so I said, that's what I want to do. And I don't really care about being the biggest or the best or whatever. This is kind of what I want to do. So I embarked on this journey really to be the best consumer investor we could possibly be, by the way. And the other part that was relevant was we were in the middle of a recession. People forget that, in the late 80s. And it was quite a deep recession from a consumer standpoint, number one. Number two, the consumption was really driven by baby boomers. And today we talk about millennials or Gen Z. They're really the children of the baby boomers. So this was a big wave of people and scale. And more importantly, they were really quite different psychologically from their predecessor generation. So what arose out of this wave of new demographics was new forms of companies, brand, channels, et cetera, that arose literally from the baby boomers. So we were kind of in the early innings of that wave. You could see it plain, in plain light, that this was going to be different. And so I love the alchemy of all that.
What were kind of the early deals that shaped the firm's vision or the firm's mission, or just what the firm eventually became? Were there any early deals that, fast forward from 1989 to maybe mid 2000s, what were the deals that shaped the firm?
Well, the deals that I look at and think about are deals that not necessarily were the most successful or deals that people knew about, but I like the deals that began to sort of evolve our firm into a different definition of consumer. So the first couple deals we did were in the restaurant category, broadly speaking. And at a very high level back in the 80s, early 90s, there was more demand than supply. And as a result, the more you bought a restaurant chain, and you could predict with some level of efficiency how the next unit would look like given the disequilibrium between demand and supply. Today, by the way, that's not the case, right? So it's about market share grab, which is a very different sort of economic treatise. And but back then, because you had this sort of structural imbalance, we saw that and we invested. And one of the deals, we did many of them, but one of the deals that was notable was a company called P.F. Chang's. We did it when there was two units, and it wasn't, and it was sort of a restaurant business on the one hand, but it began to evolve two other vectors that were really relevant. One was what we call polished casual. So it was casual dining, but at a very polished, more elevated, not fine dining, but more elevated. And that created a whole new class of category, subcategory within the restaurant, sector. And the other obviously was ethnic, by the way, in this case, obviously Asian. And so back then in the 80s, early 90s, wasn't as prevalent to find a casual dining concept, higher price, more polished, ethnic, right? And we looked at that together with the management team, and we said, wow, we're going to go back this. And we could have just stayed as a restaurant investor, but we kind of consciously evolved our way. We did that. We knew there was a lot of health and wellness going on. We did a deal called Odwalla Juices. We sold to Coca-Cola. That was pure health and wellness, by the way. Peloton is another health and wellness more recently. People know about that, but the roots of executing and evolving strategy of how we entered new categories, started with there, especially retail. I would say restoration hardware back in the mid 2000s. Beauty, we did a beauty deal with a very well-known hairstylist, Frederick Fekkai. Back then, we bought the business from Chanel, sold it to P&G, and that got us into the beauty personal care category. And health services, we did a deal called Clear Choice. You see it on TV a lot. And again, that penetrated us into a whole new realm, a whole new category we've done a lot with. Food, lots of food deals, but early food deals, included, we did a candy deal called Ferrara, sold it to a very large business in Italy. We did kettle chips, by the way, which you see in the grocery stores, through a friend, by the way, who owned it at the time, which again was gourmet snacking of a product that's obviously been around a long time. We did our early pet deals. Again, brand new category when we did those. We did wellness, pet vet, et cetera, on the veterinarian side. We did Monosol, you'd never know it, but it was a supply chain deal that provided the water-soluble film that held the what is today the Tide Pods, all right, dishwashing detergent, laundry detergent. And you always wonder, what is that film that surrounds the liquid, and how does it know when to be released the product? Okay, and so this company was the leader in that, and pioneer. And so again, and there's more, by the way. I'll stop here. But the point being, each of these investments were all successful, but the one thing they had in common was they incrementally moved our firm to and widened the aperture and the kinds of category that we invested behind and now have permission to invest.
And if you took a step back and looked at mid 2000s versus today as an example, how would you define kind of differences and similarities across kind of the investment process as you scaled from, I think it was mid hundreds of millions, early 2000s, to now it's almost $40 billion in assets under management? And also the culture from then to today. I mean, you guys have obviously scaled to very large assets under management. What's different and same about the culture and the investment process?
Look, I think many of the people that were around back in the earlier days, many of them retired, by the way, and so they either retired, they moved on, and obviously you have to bring in talent, you have to bring in different capabilities, but and I think there's only 4 or 5 of us that are still involved in the firm, that go back over 20 years, by the way, or 25 years, and but what I would say is, so while there's obviously new faces, and that's always a good thing, it's always good to replenish with new people. I think, when we think about the qualities of the people we want to bring on, there are a number of things that have remained the same. And I think that's probably the most important sort of takeaway. Number one, of course, table stakes, you got to be smart, all right? You got to be, hardworking, smart, et cetera. But there's a lot of those people, frankly, that are out there. I think for our business, and you have to think about it against, a very unique situation or profile where we can invest literally as low as 5 million up to 3 billion per deal. And we can do that on a global basis, all in consumer. That's a kind of a unicorn profile. And so we're dealing with large scale mature businesses as much as we're dealing with entrepreneurial smaller type businesses. And so the range of characteristics and attributes has to be definitionally broader. It's not just about Can I do the model? Do I understand capital markets and corporate finance and so forth? You have to have a high EQ, right? That's certainly critically important. You have to learn how to communicate. Yeah, I would say you have to be humble, by the way, particularly when you're dealing with entrepreneurs. And I think sort of existentially, the people that are most successful love what they do. It's passionate. It's not just a job, right? And it helps when we make many of them owners of the firm, and so they adopt an owner mentality. And the bridge between small and large, which is the root of your question, is partly through the function of structure, how we take our partners and make them owners, how we manage that they become not just skilled practitioners, but also entrepreneurs, right? And so there's a kind of a unique alchemy that I think is specific to our firm.
And in the super early stages, when you're interviewing these people, how do those kind of characteristics manifest themselves in like the interview? If you're sitting down with them for an hour, what does that usually look like?
Yeah, it's hard, by the way. And I think for young people, there's an obvious tilt towards transactional capability. And but you look at, you try to find sort of the glint in the eye of people who not only possess the table stakes of, yeah, I know how to run a model, right? And I understand accounting and corporate finance, got it. But also I have real high passion for this, and I'm kind of a go-getter, and you can sort of glean that out, by the way, over the course of time.
I'd love for you to tell me about the L in L Catterton. You guys merged with Catterton Partners, merged with LVMH, and then Bernard Arnault's family office, which I'm not going to pronounce because I don't think I'll get it right, to create L Catterton in 2016. Tell me about the partnership. How did it come about?
Well, I think the background is because we were a consumer-focused firm, we recognized that we had the ability to bring on board partners in the corporate industry world and create sort of a disadvantage on insight and information. And then the question is, how do we then leverage those insights into investments? And so very early on, we kind of bear hugged many of some of the largest multinational consumer businesses. And LVMH was not the first of those. And in '89, I think, had the opportunity to go meet with Arnault. I always kid him, this is before Arnault was Arnault. And people knew him, but didn't really know him. And I think he took a liking. And like many CEOs, hey, I know a lot about luxury goods, but I don't know much about the rest of what's going on in the consumer landscape. So let me put some money with you and have the ability from time to time to have these conversations where I can test what we're doing relative to the world more broadly. And that conversation mimicked itself across different geographies and usually always at the highest levels of the firm. And so we were able to build a portfolio, as it were, of these relationships, he being just one of them, by the way. And so I think we did a good enough job where they kept giving us money. And in a meeting, a conversation we had in 2015, at that time, LVMH was becoming incredibly successful because it took the concept of luxury, which is predicated on scarcity, right? Never goes on sale, right? If you find it, you better buy it, because if you come back a day later, it may be gone, right? And there's no substitute for that. And which is how they're able to charge very high prices. And they took that concept and they figured out how to scale it. And they scaled it two ways. One is they widened the aperture of the products that carry the brand, right? If you go back 25 years ago, they weren't in sneakers or sunglasses or this or whatever, okay? They had a more narrow product line. So they've been able to be incredibly successful of scaling the aperture of the product categories that these brands present themselves in, and create more of a lifestyle than a transactional utility relationship, and they went global, right? So those are the two simple things that they did that created this enormous value, for them. And as a result, Arnaud and his people were traveling the world, and they were seeing the successes. And there was one takeaway, and that is the consumers in Japan or China or Australia or Latin America or wherever were just as hungry for these brands as they were in Paris, all right, or Milan or wherever, whatever brand they happened to be. And so we ended up in this conversation about, what are we doing to take advantage of that? Because here we are with, at the time, back in 2015, arguably one of the most prominent consumer-focused private equity firms, very research-intensive, very category-focused, but very North American-centric. And at the time, we had just started thinking about and executing against the Latin America strategy, and basically testing what we call lift and shift. How do we lift, the brand qualities in one region and shift it into another? And and look at the road was well paved by what LVMH had done. And it showed that consumers globally, despite cultural, language, geography, were actually quite similar and thereby, more predictable than people would have thought. And so we then sort of had quite a number of conversations that led to, in effect, acquiring their private equity business, which had another name to it, merged it in and effectively into ours. That's how the L got attached to our name, which is L for LVMH. And it was, this is all public information. It was a deal that included both LVMH as a minority shareholder and Financier Agache, which is the family office of the Arnaud family.
And I want to touch a bit more on consumers because I just find this topic fascinating, and you're obviously the kind of person to talk to about it. But over the past 3 decades, what are the biggest lessons, or what have you learned about consumer behavior that you didn't know 30 years ago?
We could spend hours talking about this single topic, but look, I think there are clear cultural language differences, geographic differences that are relevant and that are meaningful. But I think what's happened over the course of the last 30 years, and in part, by the way, driven by technology, right? It's been a great equalizer, is that there is a increasing sort of marriage between behavior in other geographies to geographies all around the world, and we're seeing that, which gives us higher conviction around what investments that we should be making, because we kind of know what the analog looks like in other geographies. Yeah, and we just closed a deal this morning in Japan, and I was reflecting on the last 4 deals we've done in Japan. One of them was a high-end specialty kind of steak restaurant. One is a specialty furniture business. One is a very, very distinctive high-end apparel business, and one was a sport fishing business. All right. I could have said those 4 deals, and it could have been anywhere in the world, right? And instead they were in Japan, which is a very idiosyncratic country that's actually quite closed off given language issues and so forth. But the behavior, the demand side of that equation actually is quite predictable, because we see analogs to these businesses in other geographies. And that's given us an ability to, create high conviction, do the right diligence, and more importantly, think about how to grow these businesses, in an outsized manner. So literally at our meetings with investors, we literally just throw on a screen all the deals that we've done by description of that year, without naming the geography. And they all could be in the Midwest or, wherever. And then we throw out, let me tell you the geographies. And people are like, wow, okay, they're all over the world. And so and I think that to me is sort of it's a telling attribute to kind of consumer global, again, companies like Unilever, Nestle, or P&G, or LVMHs of the world, they've kind of paved the way. Coca-Cola, Pepsi, they've all kind of paved the way. But in terms of private equity, I think we're probably the only one of scale that's doing this on a global basis.
What's the key to understanding what consumers want? How do you kind of understand if the demand's there?
Well, I'm still learning that. Right. Look, I think, we always say it starts with the category, right? And I'd go back one step further, which is the consumer is always right. And, never question, that consumers are irrational, right? And they know what they want. They know what they're going to buy. They know what channels they're going to buy it in. And if you present a product or service with the right price value relationship, you're gonna do okay. And the other thing, by the way, about what consumers have shown over the past 30 years is how adaptable they are. So if you think about it, the baby boomers in the US, they actually created big box retail. They created specialty retail. Then along came what? Along came online, and they shifted and began to use that in terms of online. And then all of a sudden it became mobile, by the way, right? So now they're adapting to using mobile. And now you've got AI, which has got a whole nother, another longer conversation, but it's got a whole nother sort of field and impact, to the consumer. And it'll be two-way. Up until AI, it's always been one way, right? The consumer to the product. And now, with AI, you're going to have a kind of a truly bilateral, dynamic going on, which will change things, immeasurably. And you see the early evidence of that in social media, by the way. So in terms of how that can impact consumer behavior and demand. So look at it. It starts with consumer knows what they're doing. Don't ever try to over question it, but they are adaptable and they're willing to change. They're willing to learn. And the companies that are successful, the most important companies in consumer, I would say, that are going to win are those that have evolved their product or service beyond a functional utility, beyond a transactional relationship, which tends to be a price-driven relationship, into something that's got a little more emotional connectivity to it. The most extreme being the luxury goods category, right? People know that they're paying a very high value for a product that's much higher than the cost. So when someone goes into Chanel, or Vuitton or Hermes, they're not thinking, what did this cost to produce, all right? But they have a completely different calculus, with respect to that. And so but there are many gradations beyond that. But I think evolving from a transactional utility calculus to something that's more emotional in terms of attitude and purchase behavior and the demand side, I think those are the businesses that are going to sort of win. And then you got to have attributes and characteristics, that are relevant and scalable and ownable. And if you have those things, those are the best brands.
I want to talk about an investment of yours for a second. And your partner, who I know well, suggested that I ask about Birkenstock. And if I'm correct, you guys invested in Birkenstock in 2021. And by 2024, everyone I knew was wearing Birkenstocks. I can go downstairs right now and pick up 3 pairs of Birkenstocks. Tell me about that investment. Kind of give like a case study overview of it. What did it look like? What was the process?
It was a classic situation where it was family owned for 8 generations. There was never a person on the capital shareholding registry that whose last name didn't start with a B, okay, all right, and with a K. And so the very insular, highly protected, German business, and which means it was even more opaque, by the way, kind of by its very construct. And as luck would have it, it had been run for sort of 9-10 years prior to that by an incredibly agile, thoughtful person who the family brought in, who no MBA student ever would have hired. Okay, there's a lesson there, by the way. And and this guy who never went to graduate school or whatever figured out the business and figured out the architecture of consumer, figured out it on a global basis. It's a very complicated, vertically integrated business, and developed a point of view around the architecture of the business, and that is still defines what we are today, only on a much larger scale. So we were very fortunate that this person was residing there, because the person was just as interested in the future of the brand than just maximizing transaction value, particularly in what he would deem right or wrong to be in the wrong hands. And we come along, and I think what got him and the family ultimately interested was the fact that all we've done was consumer. We had this sort of high glossy relationship with LVMH and Arnault, which helped, by the way. But Birkenstock is not in that cohort. Okay, it's not a luxury product. But having that affiliation, was helpful in terms of credentializing, if you want to call it, in a very different sort of way. But I think most importantly is that we showed great enthusiasm. We loved the fact that it was what we call an N of one, right? There was no analog, there was no, if you didn't buy Birkenstock, what would you buy? You could buy sandals, you could buy things of that nature, but not of that sort. And it was really a health and wellness play as much as anything. And it was huge TAM, okay? Had great margins because it was vertically integrated. And the people who were buying the product clearly were people buying it on an emotional relationship, not transactional or utility relationship. And you look at those things and you say, wow, there's a lot of raw material there to harness. And what we did was, support the team, added more process and systems and disciplines so that the scaffolding, of the business was secure as it grew. Because one of the risks of growth is that it could topple over if it doesn't have a good foundation. And we partnered with the CEO. And by the way, as part of the deal, the family ended up deciding to roll over a piece, which is worth a lot more than they ever thought. And they were not, at the time we started the conversations, they just wanted all their money off the table. And over the course of the dialogue, they said, well, wait a second, we're going to roll over because we kind of like what we hear. And so look, this is one where we didn't create 250 years of history. We didn't create the shoe. We didn't create any of that. But we did recognize, if it was going to succeed on the next journey, how does it need to go about, building that? And it was great, by the way. It has been and continues to be, a lot of fun. And as a result of that, we've made a lot of money, which is great. But that's not that's just a scorecard of all the things that we've done.
And if that's a scorecard, what's the goal? What are you looking to achieve whenever you go into a business?
Well, look, you want to achieve enduring value to the consumer. And whether we take a company public in this case, or sell to a strategic, or sell to some other group, or sell back to management, which has happened, what we want to be able to do is we are not forever investors, right? That's not our structure. We're going to be time-based investors. That's the model of private equity. And I always say to entrepreneurs that I meet and business owners that, I'm not going to tell you, we're not going to be here for 20 years. That's not what we do. Here's what we're going to do. We're going to open up the aperture to capabilities, resources, globally to the extent it's relevant, faster and more efficiently than you ever would have on your own. And we're going to be thoughtful partners along this journey and help you scale, by the way. And at some point, we're going to have to get out. That's the quid pro quo. And so be transparent about that up front. But the bargain of that recognition is we're going to support you in this sort of next journey, because scaling a business, no matter how good or successful it is not a given, by the way.
On the topic that you mentioned of building enduring brands, what are the aspects of like an enduring brand? What separates like a really great enduring brand from someone that just like a good brand?
Yeah,
What's the aspects? What's the separation?
there's so many attributes that, and each case is got its own idiosyncratic, elements to it. So it's a little hard to generalize, but I would say enduring brands, like I said, whether they're large or small, have a very special relationship with its target customer. And the most successful are those where that relationship expands a broad geography, right, and of scale and number. But it can be a very small. We bought a Japanese business that is an absolute leader in the denim, especially denim area. It's a small business, but my gosh, the amount of support it gets from its customers is sort of off the charts. And in today's world of social media, activation of target customers, the efficiency of that, you're able to scale that very efficiently, in today's world using today's tools versus 25, 35 years ago. And so to me, it starts with great product or service, great price value, attributes in that product or service that transcend a utility, and which is all about price, and that the relationship with the end customer, is that there's something going on that is much more emotional. And this gets back to, Daniel Kahneman's behavioral economics, and he wrote about this in the 70s.
And I want to touch on a little bit. I find this. I could keep on talking about this. The consumer's relationship with the brand as being emotional versus just being kind of like a utility. Super fascinating. But I'd like to touch on the future a bit. Over kind of like the next decade, what are the trends or tailwinds you see in your portfolio on the consumer side that most excite you over the next 10 years?
Well, look, I would say the most interesting thing that we're focused on is technology and how that will transform. And because what technology does is it's the great equalizer. The ability to build a new product, a new brand, reach a certain threshold of people quickly and efficiently is within that environment is now upon us, and you'll see more scale in that. And that's never been the case before. It was always large multinational incumbents had massive competitive advantage because it controlled the dollars, it controlled the marketing, it told you what to buy and where and use as a consumer product. And that's what created the whole marketing industry of the 50s and 60s and 70s. And today, the marketing, that industry has completely flipped, and the marketing today is on TikTok, or it's on Instagram or Reels or whatever, and on their corresponding, equivalent in China and elsewhere. And so what technology will do is it will know everything about who you are, what you want. It'll read your mood, it'll read your time of day, it'll know when you got paid, everything. And it will proffer up like opportunities to you that are bespoke and timely. And I think that's a game changer. And I think what you're going to see going forward is an increase in more of these emerging brands founded by these entrepreneurs. And I think the challenge is going to be how do the big, large, incumbents, adapt themselves in a more entrepreneurial way to deal with all that. It can be done. They need to think about things in a different way. So I think, you want to be careful about conflating the output, which is lots of new brands and lots of new things, but what's actually the root cause of all that. And that, I think, is really the technology piece.
Yeah, I find it really interesting. It's almost like a leveling of the playing field. And
Yeah.
I mean, you can build much more now for much less, both in terms of cost and in terms of manpower. There's a couple of people building these gigantic brands.
And so when you see a proliferation of brands, one could say, oh my God, there's a proliferation of brands. What does that mean? and one has to ask the question, why?
Yeah.
What's going on and how did that occur? And what is structural and systemic about that?
Yeah, and I actually was on some kind of a call recently where a kind of a person who runs a very big farm business in the US, like one of every 4 chickens in the US hatch on his farm. He's like, how can I adapt to this? Even though it's not a tech business, how can I adapt to this and how can I make sure that I'm staying true to the times? And someone told him, he's this tech investor, he told him, get 2 to 5 people that are 20 years old, give them some money, give them free reign, put them in a box in your company, and let them do whatever they want. And just kind of
Yeah,
let them adapt. And I think that's very valid advice to a lot of big companies that are kind of stuck in the old times and suffering.
yeah.
But I want to wrap up with my final question. And I had to edit this question because this is the first podcast I've had when turning 16. And I used to ask if you had to give one piece of advice to a 15-year-old today, what would it be? I'm changing it to 16. So if you had to give one,
When did you turn 16?
August 18th. So
Wow. Okay. All
yeah,
right.
around a week ago.
Yeah.
But if you had to give one piece of advice to a 16-year-old today, what would it be?
I'll go back to my own situation. Is, number one, follow your dream. Doesn't matter what it is. You could be a fireman, you could be an artist, you could be a musician, you could be, whatever. Okay. A lawyer, doctor, finance, doesn't matter. But you got to be authentic. And so you got to follow your dreams. Because when you follow your dreams, you will be passionate. And when you will be passionate, you will generally be good because it won't feel like a job or work. It'll feel like part of who you are. And that will rouse sort of the animal spirits in you around curiosity, around going the extra mile, about working hard. Those are just attributes and characteristics of and the root of all that is, why are you working hard? Why are you curious? Why are you going the extra mile? You're doing that because you're passionate and you love what you do. And it's not just a job. Right? It means to an end. And a lot of people unfortunately don't have the opportunity, to do that. And so they retire at 65, or whatever, and they, live on a pension, and and they've worked all their lives for something else. Right. And, that's a big 40-some year period of their lives,
Yeah.
that they didn't find, other than the financial reward, they didn't find a lot of, value. And I just say for people that are, in a privileged situation and, starting out, it doesn't matter what you do, just be passionate, right? And follow
Yeah.
your dreams. And I would say two other things that are just sort of related. Travel. It's a big world, but it's highly accessible. And stay current on technology.
And one last final, like, what do you think traveling teaches you? I just want you to verbalize that. What does traveling teach people?
It teaches you that how to be respectful to different cultures, different histories, different viewpoints. You watch the news, which is, no matter what news you watch, it's pretty dumbed down and very Americanized and sanitized, and often wrong as a result, because there's so much more nuance going
Yeah.
on. And unless you've traveled to these regions like we have, it's hard to sort of pick that up. And what happens is you then ossify your thinking around, very short messaging that is not necessarily wrong, but certainly incomplete. And that doesn't help build a global, world that we are in today.
Yeah. I think, yeah, discovering the nuance, learning about the nuance is
Yeah.
extremely valuable. This has been a pleasure, Michael. It's been a long time coming, and I really appreciate you coming
Yeah,
on.
you're very persistent, but I appreciate it. You're
Thank you.
a lot of my friends you've talked to.
I try. Thank you.
All right.